During my time actually playing in the band with the Melvins, we did a lot of touring, and this was year in and year out, and it was very challenging on a domestic level, and also just physically it was really pretty tough at some times, and some of the tours made it very tough, and I'll talk about some of those tours at some other point, such as White Zombie. But the tour that I'm going to talk about right now is the Nine Inch Nails tour that took place in January, or I think it was February of 1995. And this was a couple of weeks with Nine Inch Nails. And I didn't really know about Nine Inch Nails. I had I think it was Pretty Hate Machine kind of EP or something. And I thought it was interesting. But they had then put out Downward Spiral, which became a pretty big record, as I remember. And so there was a point at which some band got canceled, their usual opening band. I'm not sure who it was, but the opportunity came up to do a couple of weeks with them in the Midwest on this big arena tour. And so we talked about it a little bit and said, okay, let's go out and do it. This was a big tour. There was a pretty big production. They were running 35mm projectors for visual stuff. This was before giant video screens or anything like that, but 35mm projectors looked really good, and they had all this custom content they'd created to go with their production. So we went out on this tour, and Jim Rose Circus was playing after us. So this was a very kind of interesting bill. I got to know Nine Inch Nails material better by watching the show almost every night. And this was a complex and big production. There's a couple of notorious things that happened on this tour, one of which was this dressing room destruction, which has been documented somewhat in the Closure video that Nine Inch Nails put out later, which was sort of part of a documentary they were making about the tour. I think at one point they had an idea about making a movie for theatrical release, but that didn't work out. And so I think the video Closure came out sometime later, and there's some backstage footage in that of the Melvins and some other people. The other thing that happened that was a little strange was this show in Dallas at Fair Park Coliseum. Fair Park Coliseum had a minor league hockey team playing in it, and so they had the ice in the arena and they covered it up with this kind of material. I'm not sure exactly what it was, so they could continue to have shows and things like that while the minor league hockey season was happening. So at this particular show, the audience came in and they weren't in a very good mood. For some reason, I think they just wanted to see Nine Inch Nails. And so we opened with a pretty slow song. I can't remember exactly what it was. Maybe some people out there who went to the show can remind me what it was exactly. Possibly even Sterilized, I don't really know, or Goggles, something like that. Anyway, we started to play this long instrumental song, which I think is about 8 minutes long or something. And immediately the crowd reacted very poorly to this. They were there to see Nine Inch Nails, and so they began to boo really heavily, pull up parts of the floor and begin to throw it on the stage. And I remember thinking, this is not a usual sort of gig, and this is quite possibly dangerous. And so it seems like more and more objects began to get thrown onto the stage, things like batteries and coins and pens and just all kinds of stuff. So we were kind of looking at each other going, well, what should we do exactly? And so we sort of retreated to the sides of the stage behind some of the side fills, all the while making this incredibly loud racket. I remember looking across the stage from the side, and it just looked like something that you kind of see in a hurricane or a big storm where there's just stuff flying through the air. There was just this barrage of stuff, and it kind of subsided for a while, and we went out there and we kind of, wound up the first song, and I think I said something to the crowd like, wow, you guys are, kind of upset tonight, and possibly said something that was mildly insulting, which created another barrage of stuff. And so we retreated again to the sides of the stage, and I remember just kind of holding my bass in front of the side fill and just getting this incredibly horrible racket out of it. I think there might even be a video of the entire set. Well, maybe Nine Inch Nails has more of that type of stuff. I'm not really sure. So this continued on, and we didn't play our regular set. We just played this big kind of rackety thing that went on for maybe 15 more minutes, and just left off the stage to this raucous booing and yelling, and people sounded like they were authentically angry about it. And I did actually get hit in the chest with a big piece of flooring, and they ripped up quite a bit of this, and the stage was just littered with it. And it was this kind of thick stuff. It would seem like it was about a ½ an inch thick and made out of some kind of sort of insulating material or something that they would use in ceilings. And they just laid this all over the floor, and about half the floor or a quarter of the floor got ripped up and thrown at us. And so then I could, out of the corner of my eye, see people literally slipping on the ice. And of course they didn't come out and clear everybody back and replace the flooring. Front quarter of the audience just had to stand on ice for the remainder of the show, which was going to be maybe 3 hours more or something like that, because they still had the Jim Rose Circus to go, and then they had a Nine Inch Nails set, which was pretty lengthy. So I'm sure people in the front didn't get too comfortable during the entire show, and curiously, they all seemed to, it was like popping a balloon, just all of the energy went completely out of the audience. Trent Reznor came out and said something to the effect of, wow, he'd never seen that before. And he said that Jim Rose was going to be coming out, and they were going to be doing some dangerous things on the stage, physically dangerous to themselves, even without a crowd being antagonistic. And he said, if I see anybody throw anything, one thing, this show's off, we're done. So the audience just kind of stood there dumbfounded, and nobody did throw anything else. Jim Rose Circus came out and performed all the stuff they did, sword swallowing and kind of dangerous things, to a very tepid response. Nine Inch Nails came out and did their show. To, I guess the audience did like it at that point, but it certainly wasn't a wild, adoring type of show like they would usually be getting. And that was the end of that gig. Curiously enough, earlier in the day, this is just a side note, Dale and I had gone to some mall in Dallas. Buzz Aldrin was signing books, so we actually got to meet Buzz Aldrin. He signed a white hat of mine, but the autograph was worn off, alas, by this point. So that was one of the weird things that happened on the Nine Inch Nails tour in Dallas. The other strange thing was in Sioux Falls. We were kind of in the hallway, and I guess maybe we were getting ready to leave or something, and we just heard this ruckus coming out of this one room, and people were just, it just sounded like there was wild hilarity and just kind of crashing and banging and stuff like that. And every once in a while, this door would open in a hall. Somebody would poke their head out and kind of look around. And one time this happened, somebody said, hey, come on in here, you guys. And so we had really no idea what was going on. So we said, okay, we're getting invited into whatever this is. And so we went in the room, and it was just utter chaos. There was maybe, 14 or 15 people in there. Nine Inch Nails band members, Trent was in there, crew members, and they were just throwing all kinds of stuff all over the place. I mean, they had a full table full of catering and cases of liquor and beer, And these were just getting thrown all over the place. And it seemed like they were trying to use an exit sign within the room as target practice for all of this material. And so progressively larger and larger things were getting thrown. I remember I was handed a bottle of vodka and told, there it is, see if you can hit it. And so I tossed this full bottle of vodka at this exit sign. I'm not sure if I hit it or not. And then they were just like, pick up whatever you want. That thing's going down. And so this wasn't, nobody in the place was particularly angry. Everybody was having kind of a really good time. And it didn't seem like anybody was particularly wasted or on any kind of drugs or necessarily drunk. This was just kind of a blowing off steam type of thing. It was sort of interesting because, I mean, there was crew in there. There was the Nine Inch Nails was in there. We were in there. And nobody really seemed like they were out of control. I mean, a couple of people were certainly enthusiastic about this. And I knew that Nine Inch Nails had had somewhat of a reputation for just venting in dressing rooms and destroying things on stage. They never destroyed anything on stage at any of the shows we played at. Here it was, we were in the center of a full-blown dressing room destruction scenario. And of course the Who and Led Zeppelin were known for this kind of thing. When you're in it, you're kind of going, okay, this is sort of weird, especially at the end of a show, because you're kind of in your downward spiral mode of getting tired and wanting to just really go to bed. So this was a really odd thing, and they kept getting progressively larger things. Couches were finally thrown at this exit sign, and I picked up a few more beers myself and threw them like baseballs at this thing. And thinking about it later, and at this point, which is decades later, it seems to me that this was just kind of a way of sort of like shore leave for sailors or something. If you're in a band and you're doing a lot of intensive touring, it's kind of like you're in a submarine and you're just there, you're sealed in, you're in your own little world, you've got a schedule that you need to adhere to, and the schedule is king, and you just need to basically adhere to that. And you've got 3 different entities doing that, and they basically collide. It just collides at showtime. Everybody's bringing their own issues to whatever that situation is, trying to keep them under wraps. So it sort of reminds me of that scene in The Last Detail with Jack Nicholson, where he's kind of going off the rails a little bit. And he is the shore patrol, so he's the guy that's supposed to take care of sailors who are misbehaving, and he's misbehaving himself within a bar, and the bartender says something like, if you keep this up, I'm gonna call this shore patrol. And Jack Nicholson says, I am the shore patrol. And he pulls out a .45 or something, puts it on the bar, and everything kind of gets a little hyper tense and then just calms down because they leave. But it sort of reminded me of that sort of thing where people are just blowing off steam, and they just, strangely, it's a safe place to do it because it's a controlled environment. And Nine Inch Nails had enough money to pick up the tab. So, and I guess they'd done this before, so they were in no way perturbed about this going on. Nobody was going, hey, take it easy, watch out, be careful. And Trent seemed somewhat aloof and just not even, he threw a couple of things, but he wasn't really the leader of the gang and egging anybody on. He was just kind of like, yeah, he'd seen it before, I think, and was bemused, but not really alarmed in any way, shape, or form. So that was my one dressing room smashing event of my entire career. And I'm pleased I got to do it in a more or less controlled environment. I feel sorry for the people that had to clean it up, but these are just the side effects of this sort of thing, I suppose. And as you get older, I mean, it comes more into context with just being able to blow off steam in a place that's relatively safe. I think Keith Moon used to throw televisions out of windows in hotels and things like that. So all things taken into consideration, this was a relatively safe way to do it, but I don't recommend anybody out there do it unless, of course, you are a big rock star and your management just makes it go away and you don't even care how much it cost. So those were the two interesting experiences on the 9 Inch Nails tour. And if anybody went to any of those shows, I'd love to hear your impressions of what went on, particularly the Dallas one, which was actually dangerous and not a controlled environment. And I think it's the first time I actually saw a crew of a band look afraid and be, worried about exactly what the outcome of this was going to be. Oh, and they were also trying to make a movie, so they had all this film production stuff around and were worried about that. But it was absolutely memorable, both of those nights, and the tour was a great tour, and 9 Inch Nails were excellent, and we didn't interact with 9 Inch Nails very much, but every once in a while I would run into a band member who would always be like, yeah, love the set or whatever, so they were watching. And a couple of times I ran into Trent on his way to the stage for their set. And I think once he said something like, well, it's time to turn myself into a drag queen for a couple of hours. And I think I said something like, just a couple of hours? And it sort of made him laugh a little bit. But other than that, they kept to themselves and we kept to ourselves, as was mainly the case in most of those big arena type support situations.